$2 billion. That was the hole at the center of the Wirecard story. Money that was supposed to exist. Money that helped support the image of a successful global payments company. Money that, according to the company's story, was there. But in the end, it was not. And when that truth came out, one of Germany's biggest corporate scandals exploded into public view. Wirecard was not supposed to end like this. It was a major fintech company. It was celebrated as a modern success story. It was supposed to represent innovation, growth, and the future of payments. Instead, it became a collapse story, a fraud story, a trust story, a story about how a company can look advanced and legitimate while the numbers underneath are far weaker than they appear. That is what makes Wirecard so powerful, because from the outside, it looked like a modern winner. It had growth, it had scale, it had prestige, it had visibility. But underneath that image, there were cracks. And eventually, those cracks became impossible to hide. This is the story of how Wirecard became one of the most famous corporate fraud cases in Europe, how the image stayed alive longer than the truth, and how missing billions turned success into collapse. Section 1. Why Wirecard looked important. To understand why the scandal hit so hard, you have to understand what Wirecard represented. Wirecard was a payments company. That alone made it powerful in the eyes of investors. Payments sounds modern. It sounds fast. It sounds scalable. It sounds like the kind of business that belongs in the future. And that helped Wirecard, because it was not selling an old industrial story. It was selling a technology and finance story at the same time. That is a strong combination. Companies like that often get treated differently. They get growth attention. They get excitement. They get the benefit of optimism. Wirecard looked like a company that had already crossed into elite status. It was not some tiny startup hoping to survive. It had become a major public company. It had serious visibility. It was taken seriously. That matters. Because major collapse stories usually do not begin with companies that look weak. They begin with companies that look successful enough to make people feel comfortable. That comfort is part of the danger. When a company starts looking like a symbol of the future, people often stop pressing hard enough on the details. They trust the momentum. They trust the narrative. They trust the image. Wirecard benefited from all of that. Section 2. The outside story. The outside story around Wirecard was powerful. It looked like growth. It looked like fintech strength. It looked like modern European corporate success. And that outside story did real work for the company. Because in business, perception buys time. If people believe a company is strong, they often give it more room, more trust, more patience, more benefit of the doubt. That is especially true when the company sits in a hot category. And payments was a strong category. It made Wirecard feel important, relevant, forward-looking. That image helped protect the company. Because once a business gets wrapped in a strong narrative, criticism becomes harder for many people to absorb. They start asking a different question. Not, is this company really solid? But, why are people attacking this company? That shift matters. Because it can delay the moment when markets and institutions take danger seriously enough. And in collapse stories, delay can be everything. The longer a weak structure survives inside a strong image, the more explosive the ending can become. Wirecard is one of the clearest examples of that pattern. Section 3. The core of the fraud. At the center of the Wirecard collapse was a brutal idea. Money that was supposed to be there was not there. That is one of the cleanest and most powerful hooks in any fraud story. Because even people who know nothing about accounting or corporate finance can understand it. If a company says it has money and that money turns out to be missing, the trust damage is enormous. That is what made Wirecard so explosive. This was not just a story about aggressive growth or overhyped projections. It became a story about whether the reported financial reality was real at all. And once that kind of doubt enters the picture, the collapse becomes much harder to stop. Because financial trust depends on one simple idea, that the numbers are real. Not just polished, not just well presented, real. If investors, lenders, regulators, and the public lose confidence in that, the company is in deep trouble. That is what happened here. The illusion of strength could only survive as long as people believed the company's reported position was genuine. Once that belief broke, the entire structure became unstable. Section 4. Image versus reality. This is what makes Wirecard such a strong documentary story. It is the gap between image and reality. From the outside, Wirecard looked modern. It looked connected. It looked credible. But collapse stories often live inside that exact gap. The outside keeps saying success. The inside is moving toward danger. That is why some of the most important collapse stories are not just about losses. They are about delayed truth. Truth that takes too long to break through. Truth that gets buried under image, momentum, and confidence. Truth that seems smaller than the story of success until it suddenly becomes the whole story. That is what happened with Wirecard. The image stayed strong longer than it should have. And once the truth became unavoidable, the fall was severe. This is a lesson that keeps repeating across corporate disasters. A business can look advanced and still be fragile. A company can look powerful and still be built on weak foundations. And the stronger the image becomes, the harder the eventual snap can be. Section 5. Trust collapses. At a deeper level, Wirecard was a trust collapse. That is what fraud scandals become. Not just accounting questions, not just missing money. Trust collapse. Because once a company's numbers become suspect, every relationship around that company changes. Investors become afraid. Partners become cautious. Institutions pull back. Confidence drains away. And companies built on confidence rarely survive a broad trust break. That is especially true in finance and payments. Why? Because those industries are built on credibility. People need to believe transactions are real. They need to believe controls are real. They need to believe reported balances are real. They need to believe the company understands what it is doing and is telling the truth. If that belief goes, the company can unravel very fast. That is one of the reasons the Wirecard collapse became so dramatic. It was not just that bad news arrived. It was that the bad news attacked the core of credibility itself. And once that happens, everything gets harder. Capital gets harder. Trust gets harder. Survival gets harder. Section 6. The moment the story breaks. Major collapse stories often have a moment when the narrative turns. Before that moment, the company is still trying to hold the image together. It is still inside the success story. It is still trying to look stable. After that moment, the public story changes. Now the company is no longer a winner under pressure. It is a company in danger. Wirecard had that kind of turning point. Once the issue of missing funds became central, the story stopped being strong company facing criticism. It became, how much of this was real? That question is devastating. Because once people ask it seriously, they stop looking at the brand the same way. They stop assuming strength. They stop assuming professionalism. They stop assuming the numbers deserve trust. And that is when collapse accelerates. Because public confidence is not just emotional, it is operational. It affects decisions. It affects capital. It affects counterparties. It affects every institution deciding whether to stay close or step away. Wirecard's image could not survive that shift forever. Once the truth pressure got strong enough, the collapse moved quickly. Section 7. Why this story fits your channel. Wirecard is such a strong channel fit because it gives you almost everything you want in one story. A clear dollar anchor, a clean fraud hook, a modern company, a strong image, a hard collapse. It is not overly technical. It is not trapped in old history that feels distant. And it has a very simple emotional core. They said the money was there. It was not there. That is powerful. And on YouTube, powerful simplicity matters. Viewers do not need to know every financial detail to feel the betrayal in that kind of story. That is why Wirecard works. It combines the feeling of modern fintech success with the shock of missing money and broken trust. That is the kind of collapse story people click, because it feels unbelievable and easy to understand at the same time. Section 8. The psychology of the collapse. This is where the story becomes even more important. Because Wirecard was not just a fraud case. It was a lesson in how success stories protect themselves. When a company becomes exciting enough, people want to believe. They want the growth story to be real. They want the modern champion to be real. They want the future-facing winner to be real. That desire can weaken skepticism. And that is dangerous. Because once optimism gets mixed with prestige, the pressure to challenge the story drops. That is how fragile structures can survive longer than they should. Success creates comfort. Comfort reduces scrutiny. Reduced scrutiny gives weakness room to grow. That pattern shows up again and again in corporate collapse. Wirecard followed it closely. It looked like the kind of company people wanted to champion. And that made the eventual truth even more destructive, because the gap between belief and reality was so wide. Section 9. The lesson. So what is the real lesson of Wirecard? It is not just that fraud exists. It is that modern image can hide old-fashioned deception. A company can have fintech branding and still collapse around a very basic problem. The truth is weaker than the story. That is why this case matters. It reminds people that innovation language does not replace financial honesty. Growth does not replace controls. Prestige does not replace proof. And when a company's credibility depends on money that turns out not to be there, the collapse is not just financial. It becomes psychological. Because everyone who trusted the image has to face the same painful question: what else did we believe that was not real? That is why stories like Wirecard matter beyond one company. They are warnings. Warnings about hype. Warnings about image. Warnings about how success can become a shield that hides weakness until the damage is too large to contain. Closing. Wirecard looked like a modern winner. Then the truth broke through. And once the missing money became the center of the story, the image could not hold. That is what makes Wirecard such a powerful collapse case. Not just because billions were missing, but because it shows how a company can look advanced, important, and successful while the foundation underneath is failing. If you want more breakdowns like this on corporate fraud, financial collapse, and business failure, subscribe and watch the next video. Because some of the biggest corporate disasters in history were built on one simple trick: make the outside look strong enough, and people may not notice how weak the inside really is.